Welcome, everyone. My name is Maureen Raymo, and I am a climate scientist and an oceanographer. I'm also the director of Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory and one of the founding deans of the Columbia Climate School. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture by the esteemed visual artist, Mark Dion. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Columbia University's School of the Arts and the Lamont campus recognizes Manhattan in southern Rockland County as part of the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger people. By acknowledging the legacies of displacement, migration, and settlement, we are taking a small first step toward the long and overdue process of healing and repair. The School of the Arts and Lamont continue to confront and address issues of exclusion, erasure, and systematic discrimination through ongoing education and a commitment to equitable representation. I'd also like to acknowledge that this lecture is being co-presented by the Columbia University School of the Arts, the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, and the Trust for Governor's Island. Thanks also to Carol Becker, Dean of the Columbia University School of the Arts, as well as Meredith Johnson, Shane Brennan, and Nicole Fogarty of the Trust for Governor's Island. This lecture and conversation is part of the School of Arts 2021 Public Programs and Engagement Series on the theme of repair. This means a lot to me as a scientist to be involved in this program. I think of the sciences and the arts as two sides of the same coin, and the communication of information, be it data on temperature or whatever, or a feeling, is so crucial to both. Our world is facing an unprecedented threat in climate change. The climate system is crying out to be repaired from the damage we have wrought through using the atmosphere as a dumping ground for invisible, odorless, but incredibly powerful and damaging pollutants, carbon dioxide and methane. And in the particular case of Mark, I have met an artist where our two worlds are colliding in his creative vision. To me, this is very exciting. An artist, a collector, a naturalist, Mark Dion uses the detritus of human culture to examine the ways in which dominant ideologies and institutions shape our understanding of history, knowledge, and the natural world. Mark's work takes the form of installation, drawing, and curiosity cabinets, the very best kind of cabinets in my estimation. Based in Copiague, New York, Dion has received numerous awards, including from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum's Lucinda Art Award. He's had major exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, the Tate Gallery, the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art, as well as the British Museum of Natural History. Mark received his BFA and later an honorary doctorate from the University of Hartford in Connecticut, and has a second honorary doctorate from the Wagner Free Institute of Science in Philadelphia. Mark is the co-founder of Mildred's Lane, an innovative visual art education and residency program in Beech Lake, Pennsylvania, and he is represented by the Tonya Badakar Gallery in New York City. Finally, if you are near New York City, you can visit Mark's new and site-specific installation, which he'll talk about tonight, the field station of the Melancholy Marine Biologist. I think I have known a few of those in my time. It will be on Governor's Island starting tomorrow, October 8th. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Mark. He will be presenting his work, followed by a conversation between us. That will then be followed by audience Q&A. And so viewers, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the webinar. So with that, I will say welcome, Mark, and thank you for coming to Columbia University.
Thank you, Maureen. I really appreciate that wonderful, warm welcome. So thanks so much. As you mentioned, the reason for my being here today is the opening of the field station of the Melancholy Marine Biologist at Governor's Island. And I could not feel more at home at Governor's Island, where Right now at the LMCC space, there's the exhibition of Meg Webster, who was an artist very important to me in the late 80s and early 90s, and still continues to be important to me. That's also accompanied by Onyedika Chuke's exhibition, which I think is excellent. And Onyedika is a friend of mine. When I go to Governor's Island in the morning from the Manhattan's ferry station, I'm surrounded by the work of Duke Riley, who's also an artist who I admire and is a friend of mine. Governor's Island has hosted projects by people like David Brooks, my former student, and someone whose work I admire. And there will be projects by Sam Van Aken, who's another artist who is really important to me, who I think a lot about. And so when Shane Brennan and Meredith Johnson invited me to do this project, I was extremely excited, and I'm delighted to be able to work with Meredith Johnson again, who I think is a true visionary. And we're just beginning to see the kinds of amazing things that she's going to be doing at Governor's Island. So it's really, I don't think I've ever felt in a more secure and positive context as I do right now at Governor's Island. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. There we go. Okay, and often, when I look at art and I think about artists, I very often ask the question, or when I read poetry or listen to music or look at a piece of architecture, I want to know who's speaking. And so, not that biography is the definitive lens by which we look at an artist, but it's not entirely irrelevant. So I want to start with this image of my hometown, New Bedford, Massachusetts. I grew up in New Bedford and Fairhaven, which you can see across the water in this image, two cities that are joined by a saltwater inlet, more like a fjord than a river, and and being surrounded by this maritime history, being surrounded by what is a pretty old history in terms of European settlement. Of course, the Wampanoag people were there for millennia, and after that, this is an area that's really about 40 miles from Plymouth. So the European history is very old by American standards there, and it's very much all in place. And you can see a lot of history in this place. And of course, New Bedford was very wealthy in the middle of the 19th century, largely due to it being the center of the whale oil trade. So before the discovery of the properties of petroleum, whale oil lit the world in a sense. And so there was a vast amount of wealth in this area. And so there's fantastic architecture. It was a great home for artists. You had people like Albert Bierstadt and William Bradford there, and Albert Pinkham Ryder is from there. So an incredibly culturally rich surrounding, which my family actually didn't very much participate in, because my family was a very blue collar, extremely working class family. My mother was a factory worker who started work on her 16th birthday. My father was a soldier who then spent his life after the military unloading trucks. So we didn't participate in culture and go to museums and listen to music in a daily way. However, when I did visit museums, I went to this place, and this is an image of the Whaling Museum. And the Whaling Museum is this great museum in New Bedford, which is a museum of natural history. It's a museum of industrial history. It's a museum of the nautical past. It's a museum of scrimshaw and vernacular arts. And it has a great painting collection as well. So the template for my idea of what a museum could be was something organized around the ocean, and something that did not represent the sort of categories of museums that we might break things into today, like a natural history museum, a technology museum, a social history museum, an art museum. The Whaling Museum is sort of all of those things mashed together. And honestly, that's the kind of museum that makes a lot of sense to me. I don't really think about these realms of cultural production as distinct from each other. They are very much, they very much feed each other. So anyway, this is so this was a really important place in my thinking, and of course, I'm very and being someone from the sea, and I'm very much affected by that, and ocean issues have been a focus of my work for quite some time now. So I think a lot about the oceans and about some of the things Maureen mentioned in terms of the unprecedented destruction of the seas, this destruction of the world through climate change and other things. So for many years, I produced works that are very much in the sort of nautical vernacular, going way back to the 90s. This is called Flotsam and Jetsam, the End of the Game. This is a work done at the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I've done works, very sculptural works on things like coral bleaching. But really my first major work in relationship to the sea was done here in New York City with the genius gallerist Colin DeLand and his gallery American Fine Arts. So in the early 90s, the very early 90s, I did a project in which I created 3 fictional bureaucracies. And the job of these bureaucracies was to organize the natural world, but using not a notion of wilderness or nature as something out there, but nature in New York City itself. So for a period of about 4 hours, my friend Alexis Rockman and I traveled in Chinatown, and we collected every fresh sea creature we could find. I brought them back to the gallery and put them on ice, and then turned this corner of the gallery into a kind of laboratory space in which I went through the process of trying to identify what all of these organisms are, right? We know about them in a culinary sense. We might not know about them in a biological and ecological sense. So I went through this process of keying these out. It's a way of identifying what species are through comparative anatomy, through looking at their characteristics and eliminating what they're not, in a sense. And this is a challenging job, even for the people who know what they're doing. And I certainly do not know what I'm doing. I'm not a scientist. I'm not certainly not an ichthyologist. And so I'm just trying my best. And if you come in as a visitor, you will see me there, kind of punching above my weight, really struggling with this task that I've set for myself. So once I do identify what something is, it is preserved and labeled. Needless to say, there's a little bit of urgency behind getting this job done, right? So if you come in to the gallery, you see me, on the verge of panic as I try to identify and preserve these organisms. And, as the organism kind of move through the space out of the ice into ethyl alcohol, across the desk where I'm using key books. And of course, it's identifying these things from Chinatown is particularly difficult because Chinatown is a really international market, right? So one of the ways that it helps to identify something is to know where it's from. If an octopus is from the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, the South China Sea, it really helps to be able to figure out what exactly it is. But in this case, all of these things are mixed together in the international marketplace. That is the fish market in Chinatown. And the fish market in Chinatown was much bigger and richer than it is today. So it's kind of narrowed down in a way. There's not as many stores there. There's not as many. The diversity of the stalls is quite minor in comparison to what it was back then. Oh yes, once my hair was dark. And so anyway, so the organisms come into the shelf, and they are preserved for quite a long time. This piece is 30 years old, I think, today, and it's owned by Bard University, and it's in the collection there. And the fish are still pretty well preserved, considering how old the piece is. So this is the final piece, and it is the the Center for, what is it? The Center for Marine Animal Identification of the City of New York, the Chinatown Division. And so my job as a sculptor was to constitute a collection. And once I've completed my job, once I've identified all the fish I could identify and place them in the cabinet, all of the apparatus disappears. So all of the stuff, all the tools I needed to do this job disappear. So I'm really interested in thinking about these things as organisms, as part of an ecology, but also part of an economy and part of the fabric of the city itself, and part of a body of knowledge which I am attempting to acquire or attempting to struggle with during the process. So in a sense, I'm always wary of the way artists use science, in a sense. I think science is our cosmology today. It has a lot of power, and an artist can seize that power by pretending to have a relationship with science that is a masterful one. So that's the opposite of what I'm doing in works like this. I'm really showing not my mastery, rather, but the struggle, but how difficult it is for me as a layperson to adopt or shadow some elements of the methodology of another discipline. So we talked about the Melancholy Marine Biologist, which is now happily situated on Governor's Island. It's not the first incarnation of this piece. Originally, the work was made for Prospect 4 in New Orleans, and it's a work that I was thinking about for a very long time. The work is very much inspired by John Steinbeck, reading John Steinbeck's Cannery Row and the Sea of Cortez. And in Cannery Row, of course, the main character is a marine biologist named Doc. And Doc has a small laboratory, which he calls Western Biological. And he's a collector, a sort of eccentric outsider intellectual, a very warm person. And his laboratory is filled with the great expression of biodiversity of the Pacific. And I thought, this is like just such a beautiful image. And the Doc character is based on Ed Ricketson, who was a real marine biologist, who was a very close friend with Steinbeck, and they traveled together and they wrote the Sea of Cortez together. And Ed Ricketson had a biological laboratory and supply house called Pacific Biological Laboratories. And so, I love that idea of perhaps peering into what this could be, what this laboratory would be, and seeing, the expression of biodiversity, which I think is the greatest expression of life on Earth, somehow embodied in this laboratory. So I've done a number of works that I call follies, that take the form of diminutive structures that, rather than have a practical function, they have a function of generating meaning, right? And so the way you encounter these follies is sort of three ways. There are follies that you can enter. There are follies that you can enter with supervision. There are sort of persons who chaperone you through the piece, and I have one of these with a collaborative exhibition with David Brooks at the Planting Fields right now, which is a project in which we both built bird blinds. And there are follies that you cannot enter, that you really encounter them by looking through the window. And that's very much the story of the Melancholy Marine Biologist. And when you look through the window, you see this incredibly rich environment of materiality around the process of marine biology. So you see what this person might be studying, and you get a sense that some of this is grim indeed. When I think about my viewer and I think about how they come to a project like this, I want my viewer to be like a detective at a crime scene, right? I want them to feel a little bit like Sherlock and Watson and try to put together, what's happening here. And one of the things, of course, that's happening is there's very little good news coming from the ocean, right? We have 25,000 gallons of crude oil spilled in the Pacific Ocean in Southern California this weekend. We have reports coming out this week that 14% of the world's coral have been lost in the last decade. That 1/3 of the world's assessed fish are now at the point of being considered overfishing, which means that we're taking more than the fish can actually reproduce. We have an estimated 1 billion pounds of plastic in the ocean, 8 million tons of which is added every year. And global warming affects the oceans in a number of ways, from surface temperature to increased acidification, coastal flooding, the destruction of coastal wetlands, and et cetera. So I can only imagine someone who's studying the ocean having to deal with a sort of melancholic situation, right? To conclude that we're kind of throwing away our greatest asset, and we've developed a kind of suicidal relationship to the natural world, and our treatment of the ocean is an incredible illustration of that. So I want my viewer to kind of look through this and see elements of all of the things I mentioned and many more within the material that's available, right? So I like that idea that the viewer is there to kind of tease out meaning and to make associations and come to conclusions based on the material that's available for them. This is what the project looked like at Storm King, in which I worked with Storm King has just one of the best technical teams in the world. So they built for me this fantastic building, which became the new Melancholy Marine Biologist Folly. For me, like the key thing about the Follies is that I can work in a public way. I can work outside in a place that's not constrained by a somewhat limited art museum going public or gallery going public. Can be opened a bit broader than that. And I can work with a building that is both a sculpture and a piece of architecture. And I don't have to give up the complexity of being an installation artist. I can still work in the public realm and be an installation artist and have that kind of rich materiality that's so important to me. So the building also, it may be a piece of architecture and it may be a sculpture, but it's also a vitrine, right? It contains the display case. Interestingly, the people in New Orleans did not take down the Melancholy Marine Biologist in time to avoid the spring flooding on the Mississippi. So I'm not sure if the piece functioned better or worse in this way, but it is very much a kind of lesson for how a piece like this can live in the world. Often when I think about my job as an artist, I'm thinking about I'm trying to go somewhere and find a red thread, find something about the place that's very particular, that's really unique. What is it about this place that is so different that maybe locals can't see it anymore, but an outside set of eyes might be able to find something? And one of those places I worked in is this town called Folkestone, which is also a faded seaside town. It's a town that used to have a very robust fishing industry, which was largely destroyed through overfishing and bad management. But it also used to be a vacation town. So before British people discovered Ibiza and cheap airplane tickets, they would go to places like Folkestone, which has a beautiful coast. In the early 20th century, late 19th century, this was a place that really attracted a lot of important English tourists. So you would have even people like H.G. Wells had summer homes here. Bernard Shaw had a summer home. And, it's the kind of place where the Prince of Wales would take his mistress to one of these grand hotels and a beautiful promenade. And it's fallen on very hard times since then. Spending time in a place like this that feels very vaguely familiar, was sensitive to what was different about this place. And what struck me is that people really despised seagulls. right? And so, which is for me kind of astonishing because I think seagulls are amazing. I mean, gulls are amazing, right? And so, but everywhere I went, people wanted to talk about how horrible the gulls were. And the gulls, people hate the gulls because some people love the gulls too much, right? And they feed the gulls. Gulls are extremely intelligent and have a lot of very flexible behavior. So they learn to associate people with food. So there's, you know, a gull who understands, for instance, how the Tesco electronic door works. And so this gull, she walks through the electronic door, she walks up to the counter, she steals a bag of potato chips, she walks out, opens it up, all of her gull friends come, it seems like they're laughing. And, you know, they understand that on Friday, you know, it's fish and chips day. So if you zoom around the corner at 60 miles an hour, you can knock someone's fish and chips out of their hands and all the gulls come and eat the French fries. Seems like they're laughing. So, you know, what gulls have is, you know, is really a PR problem. And so what gulls need is a mobile gull appreciation unit. And so the mobile gull appreciation unit travels around the city of Folkestone, and my highly trained gull enthusiasts, who I worked with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds on this project, they try to convince people that gulls are actually amazing, are not rats with wings. They are, you know, they're intelligent. They have flexible behavior. They are organisms that have been studied by ethologists for such a long time. We know a lot about gulls and what they do. I may not be able to teach you gull, but we can teach you how to really understand how gulls are speaking to each other, like what their body language and their vocalizations are. So, so we go to gull hotspots, and what we found in the course of this was that the haters, like haters everywhere perhaps, are just a very noisy minority. In fact, most people were very fond of gulls, and we thought we were going to have to convince people to like gulls. What we found is that a lot of people really did like gulls, and people had very strong personal bonds with gulls. A lot of people had rescued gulls. A lot of people had found fledgling gulls and saved them. So, so we found out that the haters were loud, but were not the majority. And of course, we also produced a lovely field guide, which could you could learn, again, not how to speak gull, but what gulls are more or less saying to each other. And it also listed all of the gulls that you might find on location there. Some, you know, this is because it's in the extreme south of England. It's a bit of a hot spot. You know, it's right on the channel. You can see France on a clear day. So there are a lot of gulls that kind of show up there that may not show up in other parts of Britain as frequently. I've done works on related to the question of overfishing. You know, fish have not only an amazing natural history, but of course they have an incredible history that is bound up with our history and with our industrial use of those fish. And that use having brought many of these fish species to the verge of extinction, and certainly populations to the verge of collapse. So this is a group of fish, and each one has a particular story like that. I mean, this fish in the front, of course, is the orange ruffy, which is a kind of a slime head fish. In the 1970s, there was fishing equipment became possible to collect fish in deeper water off of New Zealand and Australia. So people were collecting these fish for the market. The name changed from the slime head to the orange ruffy. The fish is frankly delicious, but it's an incredibly slow growing fish. So an orange ruffy can be up to 250 years old, and very frequently they're up to 100 years old. There's a very deep sea predatory fish, and with a life cycle like that, it takes them a very long time to reach maturity. So it's really easy to overfish an organism like this because it takes them so long to get to be mature and to reproduce themselves in a sustainable way. So there's been a lot of energy around trying to sustain this fishery, but I mean, sadly, these are an extremely overfished fish. Okay. Time for a glass of water, little breath. I did a project with a wonderful place called La Laboratoire, which was run by a guy named Dave Edwards, who is an inventor, a kind of scientific genius. He ran this with compliments of Harvard. And La Laboratoire creates these blind dates between artists and scientists. And so years ago, Dave Edwards called me and said, "We'd love you to work on something about the Iceman," and I had to say, I'm really sorry, I don't have anything to say about the Iceman. And years later, he called me and said, "What about jellyfish?" And I thought, oh, jellyfish. Now that's something really exciting and interesting. So he paired me with a wonderful biologist named Lisa Gershwin, who is one of the world's experts on jellyfish. And Lisa had written a book called Stung, which is about the proliferation of jellyfish around the world and what that population explosions, these kind of giant swarms of jellyfish, what this is saying, what is this saying to us about the ocean and about the ocean health? So I wanted to create something that, I wanted to create a multifaceted exhibition that would talk about jellyfish. But first, rather than villainize the jellyfish as some ecological threat, I wanted to create a situation where people would fall in love with the jellyfish, because jellyfish are extraordinary, right? They are, their body architectures are so different from ours, their way of sensing the world, their way of being in the world. And so I tried to put together something that looks like, it's a little lounge that makes it feel like Captain Nemo has invited you for tea. And so you enter into this space, and I collected dozens of pre-photographic representations of jellyfish, so we could see how artists tried to depict something that's really difficult to depict. Jellyfish they're extremely amorphous, and their body shapes change as they move. So how do you show what a jellyfish looks like? It's very different from how you show what a horse looks like, perhaps. And so you can make your way through this space. I created this jellyfish wallpaper. You can see different ways that popular and scientific texts deal with jellyfish, from taxonomic representations to environmental representations, trying to wrap our heads around what jellyfish are and where they fit, right, in the world. And of course, jellyfish are, as I said, stunningly beautiful. So the images are stunningly beautiful. There are also some fossils that we borrowed from Harvard's Museum of Comparative Anatomy, which show that jellyfish have been here for an extraordinary period of time. That these are 400 million years old or so, or more. And so jellyfish are have been part of the planet, part of the planet's life for a very long time. I also have a shelf of jellyfish kitsch, because for some reason, I guess because jellyfish are so attractive, we have been able to turn them into some of the most embarrassingly ugly items that you might find in the marketplace. Here's some educational charts dealing with jellyfish classification and jellyfish life cycle and anatomy. And then, thanks to our friends at the New England Aquarium, we were able to provide a very intimate experience with jellyfish. So, this part of the exhibition was very much the sugar, and after this comes sort of the medicine, right? Where we talk a lot about the trouble with jellyfish and what this proliferation of jellyfish around the world is telling us about the ocean and ocean's health. So this features a very brief summary from Lisa about her argument about jellyfish proliferation, and lots of information about it. So, one of the things is that a lot of the things that we're doing that are terrible for the ocean are actually good for jellyfish. So, plastic pollution in the ocean is great for jellyfish, because a lot of them have a period in their life cycle in which their polyps need to attach to something hard. So something like an oil rig or a bit of plastic floating in the ocean is perfect for that. hypoxia, air oxygen deprived zones in the ocean, these dead zones that we hear about very often, those really have very little effect on jellyfish. Jellyfish don't really need that kind of dissolved oxygen so much. Pollution has very little effect on jellyfish. It's overfishing, of course, takes away a lot of jellyfish predators, and killing of sea turtles eliminates predators from jellyfish. Climate change is allowing jellyfish to spread. When we move cargo across the ocean and discharge ballast water, we're discharging very often immature jellyfish into a new sea where they can proliferate without predators. So a lot of the things that we're doing that are just terrible for the ocean are actually great for jellyfish. And so jellyfish are responding by creating these enormous blooms. And this is a map that shows some of those blooms. And also when we're moving jellyfish around the world, we do so at our own peril, because there are a lot of jellyfish that live off the coast of Australia, for example, that are some of the most poisonous organisms in the world. And they're beginning to show up in places like the Caribbean. So that is disastrous. Of course, jellyfish have stopped nuclear battleships by being sucked into the intake valve. They've capsized fishing trawlers whose nets fill with jellyfish in the Mediterranean. So there's a lot going on. We also worked with students from Harvard to come up with sort of responses to some of these issues. And one pair of students fell in love with the notion of hypoxia. What is it like to live in an oxygen-deprived situation? And so they created a hypoxic chamber in which you could come and sit on these very cozy chairs and breathe oxygen-deprived air. This is a really bad idea to breathe that air, and you will end up with an incredible headache and a feeling that you're not getting enough oxygen because you're not. So a really interesting experiment. I wouldn't recommend it. Another group, because of course jellyfish are mostly 99% water, but what else is in there are things like collagen, which can be used as a food additive. So there were several students who came up with the idea that if you can't beat them, eat them. And one of the ways to deal with jellyfish blooms would be to harvest jellyfish and eat them and turn them into a marketable ecological product like cupcakes. So, and I've done a lot of more sculptural work. So this is a sculpture piece called Sea Life, which is based on two parts of the world that are kind of disappearing in a sense. They're becoming more rare, that are parts of the world that I very much love and care about. And one, of course, being the oceans, and the other being used bookstores and being the sort of culture of being a flaneur and buying books on the Seine in Paris, for example. So all of the books in as many languages as I could get my hands on here talk about the ocean. So talking about the ocean not only as a biotic community, but as something that has inspired human art, literature, and culture. This is another work called Sea Life, in which there is a cabinet, and it's filled with what appear to be organisms of extraordinary form that are very much like marine invertebrates, like jellyfish and like anemones and like nudibranchs. But when you get up close, you realize that these are actually either kid toys, sex toys, or dog toys. Sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. This is a place called Fort Point. It's obviously in San Francisco. Fort Point has been a fort for a very long time, but Fort Point has never really fired a shot in the defense of San Francisco Harbor, but rather the only war that Fort Point is waging is the war between the sea and the land, right? And this is an extreme marine environment which does a job on cannons and on mortar and on bricks and on all military hardware. So the big war at Fort Point is between the sea and the land itself. So I worked with my wife, the artist Dana Sherwood, who is truly an excellent artist. And we produced a series of objects from the history of Fort Point, going back to its origins. But these objects we encrusted with, with both artificial and somewhat natural objects to make them look as though the Fort Point has been losing its battle with the ocean, which it actually has been. So these objects appear that they've been underwater, and they tell a lot of the sort of narrative of the last 300 years in San Francisco Bay. I love these. Also on the West Coast, another project that is in the category of folly is the ship's chandler. As a kid growing up in New Bedford, I was absolutely fascinated by these stores, which were very prominent at the time, that sold goods for the marine industries. This is in the Port of Los Angeles, across from San Pedro, where this is. This is right next to the Marine Museum. You can see the Port of Los Angeles, which is where so many of the goods from Asia arrive into the United States through the container process on giant container ships, and then they're loaded onto trains and trucks and driven across. And so if you look back, and the history of this area is very much, the history of the Western development of this area as a port is very much post-photography. So you can follow that history from the beginning, in which there are only a handful of sheds, and they look very much like this chandler. This chandler is designed to service a fishing industry that really doesn't exist anymore. So this site was quite developed as a place for the sardine industry and for other aspects of the California fishing industry, all of which have been tragically destroyed through overfishing. So, but when you look in, you see this incredible material cacophony of things that are used to help us negotiate the difficult environment of the sea itself. So various fishing equipment from the 19th century till today, and very much feeling like the kind of store that you might have found on this site not so long ago. Again, I want my viewer to kind of decode what's going on here, to look at the unopened mail, the vials of prescription drugs, the elements that are on the pin board. There's a lot more sort of frame photography in this work, and to be able to make to be able to kind of piece together a narrative of what's happened to this place. And in a way, this is very much a place that talks about resource exhaustion and poor resource management. As I said, when I go to a site, and all my work really starts with a site visit, and very often I'm confronted with an absolutely abysmal site like this. This is in the town of Starboren, which is a wonderful place in the Netherlands, in Friesland, and it's one of the towns that is part of the 11 towns that people used to be able to visit during an important ice race, where the canals would freeze over in the winter, and on a particular day, very hardy Dutch skaters would start early in the morning and skate on the canals until they'd visited all 11 of these towns. And the towns were were bonded by this race, which it was for Dutch culture extremely important. You know, I mean, the Dutch king sometimes would participate. There's a moment where the Dutch Olympic team decide not to go to the Olympics because the canals froze over and they'd rather do the canal race. So it has an important place. And there was a curator recently, since these canals have not frozen since the 90s, to the point where they can be iced on, they can be skated on, wanted to bind these towns again through water, through a relationship with water, and curated 11 fountains. So I was given this site in Starborn, and Starborn is not a place where people are particularly warm to public art. So it took a lot of negotiations and discussions. One of the interesting things about Starborn is that it was a seafaring town. It was very importantly an export town, and also a town with a very vibrant fishing industry. And then in the 1940s, a vast dike was built, which forever cut the town off from the ocean. So it no longer has direct ocean front. So the entire culture of the place changed dramatically, and it became more of an agricultural community than a seafaring community. This I was super interested in. So I did my first notebook drawings, made more complete drawings of a way to bring the fish back into the town. And there's a kind of mythology. I built some models, which absolutely terrified the people I was trying to convince. And then working with my partners at Scientific Art Studio on the West Coast, we began to refine the models, started production of the piece. Sorry. This was obviously a very big day for me. And then we placed the work in this absolutely miserable square where normally the garbage cans and the recycling go. And this is the opening day, of course, freezing cold. And at one point, you know, every minute for 11 minutes, all of the fountains across Friesland were turned on at the same time. So this is how I like to think about the fountain, and this is the way the fountain functions. Normally in the summertime, it is meant to be participatory. And even though I work very much as a kind of critical artist, when you're making a fountain is really a kind of expression of joy and play. And so that's really how I want that fountain to function. Okay, I'm just about out of time. I can very quickly talk about this. This is the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco. This is what it looked like in 1910, the day it opened. The Oceanographic Museum was the brainchild of the first Prince Albert of Monaco, who was not only the head of state, not only got a piece of all the action in the casinos, but he was also a very decent cetacean taxonomist. He was a whale scientist. And when he had free time, he would go with his team of climatologists and marine biologists and oceanographers and sail and study the sea. And he wanted to build a temple to the sea that was the marriage of art and science. And this is what it looked like. In 1910, by the way, you know, modernism is pretty well kicked off. So it's not obvious that you would make a building like this. This is the front and this is the back. Okay, that's my time. And the back faces the ocean. There are 2 top floors of museums. There are 2 floors of aquarium, and then there are 7 stories of scientific research facilities. So, and that's the way it was in the beginning, and that's the way it still is. There's still very active and interesting science being produced here. This is what it looked like inside. This is the hall that shows all of the equipment, because everything that these scientists did, they had to invent themselves. So fantastic, the whale hall. Jacques Cousteau, who's there next to Grace Kelly, and what's his name, was the director for a long time. Cousteau kind of used this as a way to have access to all of the fortunes that exist in Monaco in a way, and turned the museum into a very, perhaps a more interesting message in terms of an ecologically focused museum, but maybe his design team and exhibition team were not the best. So anyway, the museum now is interested in going back to its past, while at the same time does contemporary exhibitions, and has always been, from the very beginning, concerned with ocean conservation, and it continues to be. And the current Prince Albert is actually, you know, really involved in ocean protection issues. So they invited me to do a series of works in the exhibition, to put my work in the natural history space. Of course, my work kind of looks like natural history anyway, so it's really hard to tease out what's my work and what's the museum, which is something I love and adore. But the real problem with this museum is that, like most museums, it only shows a small percentage of what it has. Most museums show between 2 and 10% of what they actually have. So how do you show more stuff? And they came to me with this problem: how can we show more? And so I kind of made a design based on a kind of Wunderkammer model. Dana and I searched for a period of about 2 years into the deep back rooms of the museum, looking at the collection of technology, the biotic collections, and finally I produced this oceanographic cabinet. This is the Oceanomania cabinet. It contains a lot. I mean, I think we certainly we raised the percentage they show by at least 10%, showing the publications, some of the smaller specimens, wet collections from various expeditions, scientific instruments, art made from mother of pearl, from corals, from all of this. Their painting and scientific illustration collection, something about the Cousteau's period, something about Prince Albert's period. So creating this kind of looking backward toward the Wunderkammer to move forward and telling a story that often is not the story that museums tell, which is their own story. I would love to tell you more, but I am totally out of time.
That was stunning. What a stunning room that is. It's hard to believe that's like modern.
It's permanent too, which is what I love about it, is that it's been there for a long time and will continue to be there, which is, I really dislike when I make something and it's just there for 3 or 4 weeks and it disappears.
Oh yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I can't wait to go to Monaco and see that. Jacques Cousteau was a hero of mine as a child, and I think most oceanographers of my generation became oceanographers because we grew up watching Jacques Cousteau's videos in the 60s. I wonder if you watch those too, and it makes me think of that also utterly stunning fountain that in the Netherlands there, and it makes me believe that you will spawn a generation of ichthyologists.
Well, I share your admiration for Cousteau, right? And was very influenced. There was so little programming like that available here, and Cousteau's, the way he interrogated issues and bringing this kind of marriage of the humanities and the sciences. And also it just made science look like the sexiest thing you could do, right? There's all these kind of great guys and they're eating and they're in their Speedos and they've got their like red hat and they're going to different parts of the world. I mean, how could you not want to be a marine biologist after growing up on that show? And I did see Philippe Cousteau speak at the Whaling Museum, which was, one of the first times I remember being like starstruck. Like, here's someone who I've seen on television, who I relish his opinion and his perspective, and he's right there in front of me.
That's pretty special.
Yeah.
So you started your talk by saying it's really important to understand who is speaking. And I wonder if you care to elaborate that. Did the jellyfish speak to you? I mean,
well, I think, people's perspective, often in art, the biographic can overwhelm a discussion, right? But I do think it's interesting to know where people come from and what's their, what has motivated them. And certainly I don't think about myself as making autobiographical work, but certainly where I come from has absolutely shaped the way I see the world and the things I care about. So I feel like that's really important. And it's interesting because you don't often get that where often that's the case in art, but you rarely get that in science, where you understand who are the people, where are they coming from, what is their biography, and how does that shape their perspective and their choice of pursuit in a way.
Yeah, that conversation is starting in science in a really interesting way through this this concept growing around co-production. Like, is there only one way to find a truth? And it's the scientific method versus indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge, things like that. So very much aligned with what you're just saying. Whose perspective and what's the question and who's speaking?
Yeah, I think that these are, for me, just really they inform worldviews, and that's really important.
Very cool. So I also love the idea that you had there of sculpting a collection as opposed to just collecting a collection. That was pretty cool too.
Yeah, I like the idea that at least in these works, there's an endpoint, which is when the collection has been constituted. And so the part that is active, I think it's really interesting when an artist can include process, right? I mean, process is, I think, the most interesting part of being an artist. And I am fortunate to be an art educator and to have a lot of friends who are artists. So I go into the studio all the time. I see things being made. I understand how they are made. And I see choices that are not taken in the roads that are not taken in the final thing. I've never seen a painting that was more interesting in the museum than it was in the art studio, right? But I can't take everyone by the hand and bring them to the studio. But what I can do is, in a sort of somewhat theatrical way, I can capture that moment and present that for people. So that the process of making something becomes part of the exhibition of the something. And so even if it's only for part of that, you do get to see that moment of production, and you get, and I think through that, you really understand what are the things that the artist wants to emphasize, and also understand the mistakes. What's important about some of those projects is not my success, but my failure, and with that you see that I'm doing things that are challenging, and I'm sort of shadowing a methodology, but not exactly getting it. And I think that kind of, we don't visualize our failures very often.
Obviously I'm just probably the most dyed-in-the-wool scientist that exists, and in bringing that lens to your lecture, one of the things that really struck me was when you were talking about the Department of Marine Identification in New York, how you weren't working as a scientist but an artist because it was a struggle rather than a mastery of it. And all I could think of is like, research is a struggle.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of a quote that I've always loved, which is, being a research scientist is about being able to work productively in a state of confusion. Once you've mastered something, you solve the problem, it's boring, it's time to go on.
Right. And again, that part of that process isn't what you see, right? What you see are the results, and you see the peer-reviewed papers, and which I mean, very often things don't go as planned, and there's a mechanism for talking about that, but you don't always see it in that way. And the structure of those papers is designed to kind of minimize the humanity in many of those situations because of the demands of the writing style, right?
Yeah, that's for sure.
And I feel like they're the intermediates are really these kind of scientific journalists who in some way can help, but I often feel like they're kind of trapped in the idea of presenting science with a degree of certainty, which is what people seem to want from science, but that's not what science is about, or at least that's not what my understanding of what science is about, is certainty, that it's really like dynamic and changing. And you know, that to me is the most exciting thing about science, is not, you know, you know, have some affiliations with some systematics and taxonomy people, and you know, it's not that they come up with something concrete. It's just like, it's just everything is tentative and can change and does change, and that's the real thing about it. You know, that's the core of it. That's the fulcrum. It's not about defining things forever. It's about, you know, tentative solutions for what we know right now, with the openness that this is going to change. This could easily change.
So do you, you know, this is interesting, coming back to the problem of climate change, for instance. You know, I give science talks about climate change. You're creating art that speaks to change and destruction of the environment. How do you frame your conversations with the layperson that's in the audience and saying, wow, how do I engage with this in my life? This problem.
Really, I think it's tricky. You know, I mean, you know, the work I did in the late 80s and early 90s, I sort of thought that so much of our, you know, the sort of crisis in biodiversity was really an information crisis. Like, surely if we knew about the situation in the Amazon, we would modify our behavior in some way. And at a certain point, it just became really hard to make that argument. Like, it's not an information problem.
Yeah.
It's another kind of problem. You know, it's a problem of will. It's a problem of leadership, and you know, it's a problem of really calling out the people who are actually responsible for this, right? And so it's not so, you know, it would be really, you'd have to be living in some cave to not understand some aspect of what's happening right now. And yet there's still like tremendous resistance to it, because people feel, well, I'm not really sure what they feel. It's really hard for me to wrap my head around climate deniers. And I can understand people being in crisis about what to do, because there is a kind of gap there in terms of having a model, you know. And as much as I'm very sympathetic with Greta Thunberg, I don't think she's necessarily the best model for those people, right? She's an intellectual, she's a she's foreign, all of these things that are suspicious to this group of people from the beginning, even though, you know, I find her arguments utterly convincing, and I do think, you know, she can't be our only spokesperson.
Yeah, I mean, well, you mentioned, you know, a failure of leadership. I mean, I'm somewhat heartened by the fact that I'm seeing more and more of our kind of captains of industry,
Right,
stepping up and realizing that this is, you know, you can't have an indefinite world based on just a level of consumption of resources that will ultimately lead to collapse.
right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you're right, that we are having more and more industry people realizing that this is existential for them as well.
Yeah,
But I think a big part of it is the machinations of capital and of capitalism, and our inability to find another system of value other than money, right? That's since we are increasingly a sort of secular society, and those traditional values have gone out the window. You know, what something is worth financially seems to be the only value we've been able to replace a more esoteric value to things. And so I find that, you know, I think that, you know, when we're making the list of who's responsible for this, certainly the system of capitalism itself is as much responsible for this as the people who have intentionally misled us from the Wall Street Journal and from the petroleum industry and from a whole series of other things. You know, when I was thinking about this lecture, I wanted to pull up some statistics about ocean plastics. The first hit on the website is from the plastics industry itself. You know, finding a way to explain this and finding a way to turn the blame onto the consumer, right? Which is, I find, one of the most frustrating environmental tropes to, you know, to, as a policy, destroy mass transit and then blame the viewer for driving, blame the public for driving too much, you know, to, you know, produce energy in an incredibly dirty, inefficient way, and then complain that people aren't changing their light bulbs to fluorescent. I just find that so evil and intentionally misleading.
Mhm. Can I ask you a question from the Q&A? So Vanessa asks, I feel that your work has a lot to do with how science and technology have become mechanisms of death through the objectification of the world. Do you believe that your work in some way is a ritual of mourning?
I definitely do think that a lot of my work has gone from really being sort of didactic and almost agitprop in a sense to really in a way being about mourning, and that's sort of the melancholy and the melancholy marine biologist. I don't, you know, I don't really blame science exclusively for that. I mean, because I think that there's a lot of, you know, saying something like science describes, it's just one word that describes an incredible number of activities. Not all of them are so Thanatos based, right? And so I do think the, you know, the objectification is a problem, and a lot of my work is really about not so much, you know, there are artists, of course, who are real science-based artists, right? Who work with scientists, and I think and are very much in this art and science category. I think of myself as really kind of art and history of science artists. You know, my approach is really to be a kind of visual culture historian, in a sense, trying to look at you know, like how we evolved this suicidal relationship to the planet that is a really existential problem. And a lot of that is based in the history of ideas and the history of things. So that's kind of what I feel my job is. But I, like with facing climate change, I feel like it's all hands on deck, right? We need every kind of artist, we need every kind of person coming up with solutions and coming up and participating in this discussion. You know, we need those people who take like incredibly beautiful images of places and animals to help build empathy, right? We need those artists who work with engineers on practical solutions. We need, you know, we need the artists who are trying to represent what this grim future might look like. You know, people like Alexis Rockman. You know, we need, you know, we need artists who are thinking about our human-animal relationships in more complex ways, and you know, we need artists coming in with the indigenous knowledge and other ways of looking at it. We need, it's like we need everybody, and the last thing we need to do is fight between ourselves. And you know, we're definitely all on the same team, and I think many scientists are also on this team. You know, I think we talked a little bit about this. I don't think that art and science are the same thing, but art and science are great allies because we do have the same enemies. You know, the doctrinaire fundamentalism, greed and stupidity. You know, I mean, I do think that we share, we share a disdain for the people who are putting profit over a long-term security of our planet.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about this. what really resonated what you said earlier was just about how, they take away the public transit and then blame you for driving a car, for instance. And I think about the global warming problem and the environmental degradation. And so much of what you showed, overfishing, plastics in the sea, ocean warming, and acidification, at its root of all of it is consumption.
Right.
So, we share this personal responsibility through our choices that we make for consumption, but the system doesn't make it easy for us to have good choices either.
Right.
And so bringing together that changing the culture of consumption in the world, along with a corporate and economic systems and energy systems that provide us with reasonably priced choices, hopefully would move the needle on this in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely hope so. But I do feel like, I think your observation is correct. Like even the captains of industry who we can't and shouldn't trust, but even they are understanding that something must happen. I often wonder with people, who are just so toxically invested in this stuff, like what is their end game, right? I mean, profit is
Do
profit
they
is,
have children? Do they have
yeah,
grandchildren?
yeah, exactly. I mean, at a certain point during the last administration, during the Trump administration, I just tried to think, like, what could possibly be motivated? It can't be money. These people have so much money. I mean, I can't understand the disdain for the future to such an extreme. And I just thought it must be satanic. It's practically satanic. Like that you intentionally are bringing about the ruin, because it just feels like intentional. Like, you're intentionally ruining the planet.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I want to go there, but that's
Yeah.
a question. So Carol Becker is asking, Mark, can you talk about the virtues, complexities, and freedom of being an amateur taking on such issues?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I do love the motivation of the amateur, and partially because of what we're just talking about. When you take money out of the equation and you replace it with passion and love, that's something else, right? So people who are interested in these things, no one is interested in birding because of money, right? They're interested for entirely different reasons. People don't become paleontologists because they're looking to make their fortune, right? And so I have great admiration. Yeah, I have a great admiration for people who make these choices that are so contrary to the dominant capitalist narrative, which is that you should make choices based on love. And I really wonder how that's structuring the world. Very often I work with departments of humanities as much as I work with departments of art. And I'm always sort of stunned when I walk into a room and every student is a woman. And I think, like, where are the guys? Like, what the heck are they doing? And it's interesting that these people have made the choice to study something that they're passionate about, that's really interesting and wonderful and just gives back so much. And I just try to imagine in my mind's eye this other room that's just filled with men. And I don't know where that is or what they're doing because it's outside of my world. I'm very, very interested in the people who are motivated for other reasons than money. Mm-hmm. I think the role of the amateur is, it's something that there was a great degree of disdain for until pretty recently. But now, people understand, at least in the biological sciences, the importance of citizen science and how you can motivate an army of people who are interested and want to do this work and want to make a contribution, but are not professionals, right? And I think that that's incredibly exciting. I as an artist, I'm just really fortunate that one of the great things about being an artist is that you kind of write your job description every morning. And so I am able to make my passions the core of my focus. And when I'm interested in, I'm able to, if I want to go to the tropical forest, I come up with a project where I need to go to the tropical forest. So it's an incredibly privileged position to be an artist. But if you're not, if your work doesn't revolve around the things you care the most about, then you've kind of lost the point.
Yeah, I feel the same level of privilege as a scientist, and be able to pursue what interests you. It is a great privilege. I have another practical science question. Have you ever been able to go to sea for any length of time? I mean, clearly the ocean draws you.
Yeah. Well, I did a project that was called Gaia, and it involved a team of artists and scientists going to off the coast of Alaska to some of the islands where the Northern Pacific Gyre is just tossing the world's trash up onto these islands, which have don't have people on them and haven't had people on them for many centuries probably. Mm-hmm. And nevertheless, you'll boat up to one of these islands and you'll have to wade through knee-deep trash to get onto them. And then you'll go into the interior of the island, a mile in the interior, and it will look like there's just been a light snow, but it's all broken up styrofoam that's blown into the center of the island. So it's really grim. And this was organized by Pam Longobardi, who's an artist who works with ocean debris issues and has done for a very long time. And she's really one of the people who really pioneered working on this. And she did this with the Alaskan Sea Life Federation. And we had wonderful people like the writer Carl Safina was on the trip, and we had scientists from NOAA. And so you had this, it was very much like the early 20th century expeditions where you had artists and scientists elbow to elbow on a research vessel, each pursuing their own interests, whether that was climate readings, or it was surveying trash, or it was depicting it and collecting it for representation later. And so that turned into an exhibition that traveled. So that was really one of my sort of most remote expeditions. I've been wanting to do it, something related to William Beebe's 1923 Arcturus expedition, which, the 100th-year anniversary is coming up on that, where we kind of follow Beebe's route from the Sargasso across the Panama Canal to the Galapagos and some islands off that. And again, it was a situation in which you have artists and scientists together, but because it was a scientific expedition, there's great documentation about what they saw and what the Department of Tropical Research saw and collected. And you would be able to make a really interesting comparison, and everything from temperature to biodiversity.
Well, Mark, let's talk about that. I have a ship right here at Lamont.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
And that sounds like the kind of thing NSF would be interested in. I mean, that would be great.
Yeah, I think it could be really interesting. And, Beebe's expedition was enormously popular. It was front page of the New York Times. There were radio broadcasts, and, he was that, he was that celebrity scientist. He was what today the Attenborough is, or in the 70s, the Cousteau was. I mean, he was that for the turn of the century. Great popularizer of evolution and biodiversity.
And what year is the 100th anniversary?
Well, his trip was 1923.
23, so 2 years.
Yeah,
that's
2 years.
Lead time to get that funded.
I know it is the decade of the ocean, right?
Yes. So Catherine Walter has a question. Love your work. Thank you. Can you talk a bit about how you fund it? And I'm going to add to that, and how you source the stuff you have in your followings.
Yeah. Very often it is funded by the organization that organizes it. So I'm lucky enough to be on a kind of sort of biennial, triennial, documenta, Munster-like cycle of exhibitions. And so certainly early on, I did everything myself, and just work jobs and put all my money into making work. But very often I'm approached after sort of decades of doing applications and the normal ways that we all try to get things funded, and sometimes having success and most of the time not having success. But now I'm at the point where people approach me with some funding in mind, and then we try to put it together. But it's not easy, but it's nowhere near as hard as it was. I've been doing this for a long time, but it's nowhere easy. It's nowhere near as difficult as it was 30 years ago. And I source things. I'm like constantly sourcing things, and I work with different people on different projects. So I have people who can paint with me, and I have people who can do carpentry, and I have people who can sculpt, but I don't have anyone who can shop, because that's the hardest thing to explain to someone why, if we have 10 hammers, which is the right hammer for this work? There's only one of them that's perfect. And it's hard to explain to people why that one is the right one. And I'm in flea markets, yard sales, junk stores all the time, and which is difficult. New York City is a terrible place for that kind of stuff, but I'm often out in the countryside. And next week I'm lecturing in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm already in touch with the students about junk stores and antique stores and thrift stores. And so I take these opportunities to source things, and it takes a long time. So for instance, the Melancholy Marine Biologist, really, that's sort of about 1.5 years of hunting things.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I'm sure there's a lot of students in the audience. Do you have any parting words you want to share, life advice, any inspirational thoughts?
I think, the thing I mentioned that if you're a young artist and you need to build your work about the things you care the most about, right? And hopefully that's not just yourself, right? So, we are in this moment where it's a really existential moment about the future. And so I can't think of a more important thing for artists to be thinking about and dealing with. And, I'm interested in artists who make issue-based work, and there are a lot of artists who are working on this. There's wonderful people like Blaine de Saint Croix, who's like a fantastic artist who works really specifically on climate change and collaborates with scientists and works on these projects. There's so many artists who are doing things like that. Brendan Belanger, who is a scientist and also an artist, and in a way that very few people are. And so I think there are these interesting models. I'm always crushingly disappointed that the art world, in a broader sense, is not more focused on these issues, right? That there really hasn't been a major museum exhibition here in New York in a long time about these issues. And as important as I think some of the things the museums are doing now, it's just hard for me to imagine something more important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, Mark, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate you coming. I should remind everybody that you can see the Folly out on Governor's Island starting tomorrow. You might be able to see some of Sam Van Aken's Tree of 40 Fruits as well, which are quite fascinating. I should thank again Columbia University School of the Arts. Thank you, Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, and the Trust for Governor's Island. Thank you all for making this wonderful event happen. So Mark, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this, Maureen. I really appreciate it. And I hope we should come together and talk about this
Well,
exhibition.
Yeah, and you should come to Lamont. I have a big giant mansion that is filled with old science stuff.
Yeah, let's do it.
We're trying to empty it out.
Okay, I'm the right person.
Yes, I think
I'll
so.
come with a U-Haul.
Okay, bye, everyone, and
Very
thanks
good. Thanks so much.
for running the show behind the scenes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.